have to switch to speaking mode from listening mode. This was a very interesting set of presentations so far. And some of these presentations actually touch on points that I'm going to make. And if that's the case, I will just skip over them quickly. So financial stability and climate change, how did we get here? That's what I want to touch on, and what are the implications? The specific angle I will start with is how central banks got into this picture, because that's not completely obvious. So that's what Harrison referred to earlier. Central banks are now very actively researching this topic and introducing policies, and we want to understand how did we get here. And so my understanding, how this all makes sense is that in a way we have to go back to the great financial crisis or the global financial crisis and see how central bank mandates changed after the crisis. And essentially, the change was that there's a new focus on financial stability, on the financial stability component of central banks that had been forgotten, and that now became central again. And then, in addition to that, the idea of macroprudential policies is a big innovation, which implied that the focus for financial stability should be on the stability of the whole system, not just the stability of individual institutions. That was a major change. And along with that, a policy that has become now mainstream, which is the periodic stress tests of the stability of the system under particular adverse scenarios. Now, climate change gives rise to new systemic risk. That's the angle that makes this relevant for central banks. And here the history is interesting. The first meeting of central banks to discuss this was in April 2018. Involving supervised for about 30 countries, and that's when the Network for Greening the Financial System was launched. Harrison referred to earlier. And then a few months later, a first report came out by the NGFS, and here's how they justified the central bank actions, supervisory actions. Climate change risks are a source of financial risk. It is therefore within the mandates of central banks and supervisors to ensure the financial system is resilient to these risks. I should say here that the mandate question is a really important one, and it has different answers depending on the country because of the different institutional constraints. And if you want to really go into this in detail, there's a fascinating panel that you can follow on YouTube, the closing panel with the central bankers of the Green Swan conference that was held in June, that I highly recommend. But anyway, so the world today is, the US Federal Reserve joined in the NGFS in December, and now we have 95 members and 15 observers. So this is a very big chunk of the central banking and bank supervisory community. So then, if it's part of the mandate of central banks, you might ask, how should central banks take account of climate change risk? So here, I just want to give you a few bullet points that are developed at greater length in a paper I wrote with my co-authors here that are listed here, titled "The Green Swan: Central Banking and Financial Stability in the Climate Change Age." And basically, some of the points that were raised in the earlier presentations I will echo here. So the first thing that's pretty obvious to realize is that you can't do traditional backward-looking risk assessment models because we're in an unstable, changing world where climate change is becoming more and more material, whereas it wasn't in the recent past, even in the recent past. And the other major point to take into account here is that climate change is already happening. It's certain to happen, and this is a very predictable trend. If anything, we underestimated the speed at which it's happening. The third point to bear in mind here is that some of the economic writings on climate change around integrated assessment models, while helpful, and that's the earlier discussion we heard, they remain sketchy, as we've heard earlier, and they lack granularity. I think that's important to bear in mind. In particular, they don't always integrate financial markets, financial constraints, transition risk, chain reactions, social, political, geopolitical risk. So there's a lot of things that still need to be considered and integrated into these analyses. So what can central banks do, given that the toolkit seems, for now, at least severely constrained and highly limited? I think here what's interesting is how central banks are starting to take that on board. And the key words here are scenario-based, forward-looking analysis. And in some ways, you could think of the model that we just heard that Harrison presented as such an analysis, a scenario-based, forward-looking analysis. I think it's important way of somewhat different interpretation, that once you accept it's a scenario, you're less constrained in some ways, and you're looking for slightly different things in your quantitative analysis. So that's the first big point to bear in mind, where we are headed. Now, the second point, of course, is that we are facing huge uncertainty. This was emphasized in Lars Hansen's comments. Here, I just want to add that uncertainty, in particular, also lies with the effectiveness and timely deployment of new technologies. And so we need to acknowledge that uncertainty. And another thing I want to put on the table here is that we need to think in terms of system-wide transition. This is maybe something we can come back to later in our discussion. So what are central banks currently doing? Well, the scenario-based analysis has so far been implemented, or is currently being implemented, in the form of climate stress tests around net zero targets. And here the lead has been taken by the Bank of England. Bank of England's biennial exploratory scenario, which has started this year. And it's interesting to see what the Bank of England is trying to do. And this is really very much just the first step. So it asks major UK banks and insurers to estimate the size of climate change risks under 3 aggregate scenarios that it puts to them on 3 different scenarios in terms of the speed at which the UK economy will reach net zero. Then these institutions have to report back on how they will adjust their business models under each scenario. Okay, that's for now. That's as far as it goes. But eventually, you can think of this exercise as a form of indicative transition planning, with the central bank or some other planning authority, if you want, giving the pathway information in aggregate to the different agents in the economy, and then it's up to them to adapt or coordinate around that pathway. Now, of course, the challenge is enormous. here, just want to show you this picture. So roughly, while you read this picture, let me say roughly what is involved here. I mean, this is really quite staggering. So roughly, we need to decarbonize the global economy at a rate of, from now on, at a rate of 6 to 7% per year. Okay, now we've achieved that in 2020 thanks to COVID restrictions, lockdowns, and lower economic activity. With the return to full employment, full activity in 2021, global economy, carbon emissions are rising again. So we're not going to achieve it in 2021, which means that we have to decarbonize at an even higher rate going forward on a yearly basis. This is an enormous challenge. And that's what central banks are getting involved in, is trying to take control of this issue and try and manage this carbon transition. So in my last slide here, I want to maybe come back to the digital pathway to net zero, and outline what, in my view, are the four main steps to get to net zero if we ever get there. And the first point has to do with measuring and reporting carbon emissions. This was a point that was made by Amit earlier and also by Long. So first of all, what we need to measure is direct and indirect emissions. And then we need to measure them at the entity level. That's done currently pretty well for publicly traded companies. But the privately held companies, the non-listed companies, it's a dark universe. We know very little about that. So even just on the entity level, we have a lot of data still that we need to obtain. Now, what's interesting is that using digital technology, big data, AI, multiplication of sensors, satellite monitoring, we can achieve much faster, much quicker information on where carbon emissions are, what transactions, what companies, and so on. And this is what former Vice President Al Gore referred to as the age of radical transparency. And here he's part of an initiative that you might want to look at, is the climatetrace.org initiative, which is all about how one could achieve this.
Sweetie, you got, let's yeah.
Right. Okay, so let me turn to the second step. So once you have the data, you want to define forward-looking scenarios and decarbonization pathways. That's pretty clear. Then comes the third step, and we touched on that very briefly earlier.
He invested, he was health freak.
Part of the implementation of decarbonization pathways has to go through a global efficient market for carbon offsets. And here again, digital technology has an important role to play. Let me just leave it at that in the interest of time and finish with the fourth important step, which is investment in green tech. And here my view is that we need to do two things. One is should be obvious in terms, at least conceptually, but maybe not politically, which is to stop fossil fuel subsidies. And the other one, which is easy to understand when we have the precedent of how we solved COVID in front of us, and that's the Operation Warp Speed effort. That's what we need for climate, and at least for acceleration of climate technologies, whether it's a more efficient renewable energy or carbon capture and sequestration technology. We need a massive green Operation Warp Speed program to accelerate innovation. And let me stop here.
Thank you, Patrick. The discussant is Professor Eric Maskin. Eric is Adams University Professor of Economics and Mathematics at Harvard. Eric is a Nobel laureate and also a member of academic committee of Luohan Academy. Eric, please take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to the Academy for organizing this important meeting. And thanks to Patrick for his most interesting discussion. I'm going to have to offer him an apology, though, because I didn't realize that he was going to be speaking on financial stability. My plan had been to talk more or less on the same issue that Harrison and Lars were talking about, climate-friendly investment. And so I think I will come back to that issue. The ESG movement in investment has been attracting a lot of interest and momentum in recent years. Here, the E stands for environment, the S stands for society, the G stands for governance. I'm going to focus on the E part, the environment, and more specifically on climate change. And the idea is that investors...
Eric,
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you just sort of try to fix your microphone? It's I don't know if others are getting this, but there's a lot of echoes. Is that right? Okay, I'm not alone. Is any way?
I'm afraid there's nothing I can do.
All right, keep going then. That's all right. We can still hear you. It's just a little bit echo, that's all. So.
Should I speak louder?
No, that's fine. Your volume is great. It's just a little bit, yeah, that's fine.
Well, anyway, the idea is that investors will put their money only in firms that have good records on climate change. And as a result, firms will try to acquire and maintain good records on climate change. Now, interestingly, this idea goes against a view that prevailed for much of the 20th century, the idea that firms and investors in firms have no obligation to take on social concerns in their businesses, social concerns such as climate change. In fact, a famous proponent of this idea, Milton Friedman, went so far as to say that the sole responsibility of a firm is to make money for its shareholders, and doing anything else, such as reducing carbon emissions, is a violation of their fiduciary duty. Friedman's reasoning was that shareholders own the firm, and firms have a responsibility to act in shareholders' best interest. Shareholders invest their money in the firm to get a financial return, and so the firm should act accordingly. Of course, each shareholder is free to put her money toward any social goals she wants after earning her profit from the firm. For example, she can put the money into mitigating climate change, but the firm should not be doing this for her. In fact, there's no need for the firm to do this for her. So this argument sounds plausible and has certainly been very influential, but there's an important caveat to the logic, because it may turn out that many shareholders care about what the firm does socially. This is a point that was made, interestingly, in a recent paper by Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales. It may be that shareholders are unhappy if their firm is emitting a lot of carbon dioxide. And the additional money that they would earn if the firm reduced emissions, refrained from reducing emissions, may not be enough to compensate them for the unhappiness they experience from this reckless carbon policy. So this is the underlying reason why the ESG investment movement has been such a big topic these days. Shareholders themselves want firms to behave in a climate-friendly way. But the ESG movement can only go so far in solving the climate change problem. This is what Harrison and Lars were discussing. This is because it requires investors to be, to some extent, self-sacrificing. They must be willing to give up money, perhaps quite a bit of money, for the public good. And we all know that although people in general are generous to some extent, if we have to rely on generosity to provide public goods in a private way, we're likely to come up short. A much more effective way of solving the incentives for climate change is to introduce a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. The beauty of a carbon tax is that firms are charged for their carbon emissions according to the damage they do, and we no longer have to rely on altruism or generosity to solve the problem. So you might ask, why should we be interested in the ESG movement? Why don't we just impose a carbon tax and be done with it? Harrison already hinted at one answer to that question, which is that although carbon taxes could be used, they have not yet actually been used, at least not to the extent needed to come close to solving the problem. And so in the meantime, we have to make do an imperfect alternative, such as ESG. Another possible answer to why care about ESG is that even if we were imposing a carbon tax, we know that governments are always reluctant to raise taxes because the public hates to pay them. And so to the extent that there is a robust ESG movement, carbon taxes can be correspondingly lower. But I think the most important value of the ESG movement is that ultimately it may make carbon taxes politically possible. Although the political process is imperfect, and I'm thinking of the United States in particular in this respect, government does react to what the public wants. And to the extent that the ESG movement continues to grow, it will prove to governments, and again, I'm thinking of the American government, that the public and business are serious about solving the climate change problem. This is not This is not so much influencing public opinion, but rather influencing government itself. So I say more power, more green power to the ESG movement.